Okay, so very good morning, everybody. My name is Catalina Montoya. I'm the director of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies. And I would like to welcome you to this seminar series, Responding to Disruption, Government Populism, the Pandemic, and the Breakdown of Public Trust, organized by the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies, the MA in Politics and International Relations, and the European Institute at Liverpool Hope University and Lille. Now, what responses can be expected from international and national governments to re-establish trust in the efficacy of liberal and democratic politics? And what lessons, if any, have been learned? In this program of webinar Q&As, we have invited experts in their field to comment on pathways towards the re-establishment of public trust in a post-COVID, post-Brexit, and post-Trump environment. The Archbishop Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies is proud to bring together academics and practitioners who work on issues related to peace, war, and conflict from a variety of perspectives. The center promotes the benefit of drawing on interdisciplinary approaches to shed light on the multidimensional challenges that are faced by militarism and deeply divided societies. The talk today is entitled The Sovereignty Illusion, Britain, Ireland, and the Challenge of European Integration. And our special guest is Dr. Michael Holmes, Associate Professor of Political Science at the European School of Politics in the Catholic University of Lille. After Michael's presentation, we will open the session to questions from the audience. So Michael, it's really great to have you back, I hope. We're missing you, I hope. So thank you so much for accepting today's invitation. And without further ado, let's make a start.
Okay, in which case, give me a moment whilst I set up share screen. I'll just get this set up. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. So I'm going to be, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure to be invited by the Tutu Center and by the European Institute to take part in this. Not least because I suppose I can claim to have once been the assistant director of the Tutu Center. And of course, I can also claim to have been the director of the European Institute. So this is coming home for me in a way. Even if I am, I'd love to say it's 25 degrees and pouring sunshine out there. Actually, we've got showers and it's expected to get worse over the next few days. So the weekend is supposed to be pretty grim with lots of rain here in Lille, but there we go. So it's a pleasure to have this opportunity and to talk through some of these ideas. This is the development of a paper that I did for a conference organized here in the Université Sorbonne Nouvelle by their Center for Research into the English-Speaking World. Which is horribly British focused, I have to say, but I was insisting that they had to have a stronger Irish dimension to this. So I did a paper, presented a very brief paper there on the challenges of sovereignty represented by the Brexit situation. So what I want to try and do, I've been developing those ideas subsequently. So this is kind of stage 2 of what I'm trying to do, of looking through some of these issues and themes. So the structure of what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to say a little bit about sovereignty, the definition of sovereignty, and in particular trying to highlight the importance of power in relation to sovereignty, and how this creates, if you like, a legal understanding of what sovereignty is and a political understanding of what sovereignty is. And I think those two do not fit perfectly together, and I want to try and explore that kind of awkward area in between the two. In particular, I'm going to say a little bit then about the impact of the European Union on our understanding of sovereignty, and in particular comparing the British and Irish experiences of being inside the EU. I'm then going to look at sovereignty in the Brexit and the post-Brexit period, which I think have produced a number of crises across a range of issues. And in particular, I'm going to look at 3 case studies: environmental policy, fisheries policy, and Northern Ireland, and say a little bit about each of those. By that stage, I should be coming to a conclusion. I will avoid reaching any kind of conclusion and just simply say, well, who knows? But I'll be inviting questions from you, and you can rip me apart at that time. one other thing to say before I get going, a little bit of a caveat about this. I wasn't sure who would be attending in relation to this. I'm talking about Brexit. Yeah, I am specifically going to try to avoid making too much in the way of a value judgment for or against Brexit. That's not what I'm interested in doing. I'm interested in exploring what Brexit tells us about challenges of sovereignty from a legal point of view and a political point of view. And I'm saying that particularly because I'm very conscious of the fact that the morning after the result was announced, I was phoned up by the Liverpool Echo when I was still in Liverpool. They asked me if I would give them a sort of, a little short telephone interview about the operation of Article 50, the European Union device for triggering the whole process of withdrawing membership. So I said yes, and I did that, and I was chatting away, and as I very, very rarely do, I started making a couple of jokes. One of those was, I sort of said, well, the obvious thing to do is that Liverpool should immediately declare that it was going to leave the United Kingdom and join the Republic of Ireland. And this would be a perfect match. So the next day, the Liverpool Echo printed my little thing about the Article 50, which got about 2 responses, people sort of saying, how interesting. They also took this idea of Liverpool and Merseyside must join the Republic of Ireland and turn this into a big article, which the last time I looked, it's now closed down for comments and all that's been shut off, had in the region of 2,000 responses. Some people saying, what a great idea. One person I remember quite distinctly writing, Professor, you lost, get over it. Okay, it was meant as a joke, but anyway, there we go. So just in case you're worried, there is, that's the kind of the headline that they had in it. To save you from Brexit misery. I'm not going to try to argue about Brexit misery. That's kind of the comic background. Just in case you're a little bit alarmed, caveat, I'm not going to be trying to present that case. So, okay. So what I am going to try and do is look at issues around sovereignty. Again, very simple idea here. Sovereignty is the supreme authority in a state, a well-known standard political science and legal approach of how to understand it. But I think that is something that is not always thoroughly well understood in terms of how this works, how this actually functions. It's a rather difficult thing to pin down exactly what we mean when we talk about sovereignty in this way. And to my mind, there is one very fundamental constraint involved when we think about sovereignty, and that is the actual power associated with that. I'll give you one very simple example. If you've got a city, and the city council meets and they agree on making a decision, and they know that the entire population of the city is completely in favor of that, and they issue their promulgation saying, we have made our decision. Okay, that's sovereignty in terms of making the authority for a decision-making authority for something. But if the decision reached by that city is that they are ordering the volcano right beside the city not to erupt, there's a problem, because they don't have the power to enforce what they are trying to do in terms of their sovereign decision. So again, we have to take that into account. The power to affect an outcome is really important from a real point of view. So if we look at this dimension of power, we are going, to my mind, away from a kind of a narrower legal conception of sovereignty towards a more political approach, because sovereignty is very much contingent on the capacity to deliver outcomes. So I'm going to be focusing strongly on that dimension when we look at the impact of Brexit in these various different circumstances, where there's a legal authority to make a decision, but the reality of the political outcome is a little bit harder to pin down from this kind of point of view. I'm going to argue as well that there are a number of factors affecting sovereign power. Here, again, a warning to anybody out there who is an absolutely convinced leaver. I'm going to use European words here. So I'm going to talk about two dimensions, which I think are internal to sovereignty, the internal acceptance of sovereignty. So one dimension we have to look at is the demos, to use the Greek word, the citizens. So citizenship and sovereignty is an important dimension. The extent to which the decision taken by a government actually chimes with their population and their citizens. I also think another important dimension is the economic dimension. It's not just if you have the citizens respond, it's also if you make a decision, what would happen in relation to economic enterprises. So another example, had Jeremy Corbyn won the election in the UK and immediately introduced, snapped his fingers and a socialist wonderland had been created in the United Kingdom. Well, okay, one difficulty with that is, what was he going to do about business enterprises, which might then have said, cheerio, we're going to take our money, our resources, and we're going to move to another country. So again, the sovereign decision is faced with a political reality in this kind of situation. So I'm going to highlight that as the agora, the Greek word for market. And then the other element I'm going to look at is the international dimension. We need to think about international organizations and treaties, and perhaps, of course, also the globalization of trade. So the Greek word for world is cosmos. So I'm going to use demos, agora, and cosmos as three kind of frameworks to consider the interrelationship between sovereignty and power. The last thing in terms of introductory comments is to look at the European Union dimension to this. Now, this is a contested area, but I would argue European integration is not trying to abolish national sovereignty. In fact, the European Union has been constructed very carefully to try to balance between state interests and a collective European interest. So it's not abolishing sovereignty, it's changing it. The title that I use here is this idea of integrated sovereignty. Sovereignty is pooled, it's shared, rather than every country having their own little bit of sovereignty. Now, that does reduce the absolute freedom to take whatever decision you want. However, the compensatory factor is that it improves the ability to achieve your desired outcomes. So again, the power element becomes more important here. Now, again, particularly in the European Union context, the economic dimension is especially important, though we also see it a little bit in social and environmental areas. So that's the European Union angle. Let's take a look at the two countries I'm going to focus a lot on, Ireland and the European Union, because I think they give us an interesting context for this. If we think about Irish national sovereignty in the European Union, okay, historically, to put it mildly, national sovereignty is rather important in Ireland. The country is built on a very, very strong nationalist ideology. Most political parties reflect that nationalism. And for a long time, not just the political structures, but also the social and economic structures reflected a very narrow nationalistic Irish idea of sovereignty, of essentially doing an autonomous, independent Irish economy was not functioning. So a decision was taken that the only way to actually achieve real economic sovereignty of growth, of wealth, of prosperity for people in the country was not to try to do everything by ourselves. It was actually to plug ourselves into a global economy. So we traded a narrow notion of economic sovereignty, we do things by ourselves, for a broader idea of we commit to internationalization of our economy, and that is what is going to give us the capacity to produce the economic outcomes that we desire. Linked into that were shifts in political sovereignty, so that we could be a better friend and neighbor to the United Kingdom, to our European allies, and so on. And it coincided with a socio-cultural change taking place in Ireland. I'm not arguing that it was created by that, but I think there's Ireland has changed dramatically from that time in the 1960s. I would actually date it probably from the moment I left Ireland to move to Liverpool. It became a much more progressive, outward, open-looking country. So clearly I was the person blocking everything like that happening. So that's the Irish dimension. If we look across the water to the United Kingdom, British sovereignty in the European Union is an unusual paradox. Because I think to begin with, Britain is unusual because it has the historical experience of working with integrated sovereignty. Whatever way you want to look at this, sovereignty without nationalism between Scottish national identity, Welsh national identity, English national identity, if such a thing exists. So there's a kind of a multinational sovereignty, part of the British UK experience. And yet, despite the fact that therefore it should be in a situation where it can say, we know this works, that you can share sovereignty, between different nations in a collective entity from the experience of the UK. It has always had reservations about the European level of integration. So there's an economic interest in participation, but no real cultural sense of Europeanness, which is why you got all of the opt-outs, all of the rows about participation in the European Union, the two different referendums about whether or not to stay in the European Union, and then ultimately, of course, the decision to leave. So there's a very different relationship between Britain and the European Union as a result of that. If we think about specifically the Brexit campaign, again, sovereignty was a really important feature here. The Brexit campaign itself revolved around sovereignty. I think, though, it was very much the concept of legal sovereignty, particularly if we look at some of the campaign slogans of the Leave group. So things like take back control, and a phrase that came out later, this is actually Theresa May's phrase, when she was being asked what kind of Brexit do we want? And she said, we want a red, white and blue Brexit. Perhaps, to my mind, something that should win a prize for the most meaningless slogan associated with this entire period. So the more subtle political and economic arguments about, okay, how do we balance sovereignty versus the desire to achieve certain political and economic outcomes were lost in the way the debate was carried on. I'm not going to try to be too critical of those slogans. There's a nice little piece by a colleague down in the University of Birmingham, Tim Houghton, who says, in political campaigns, what matters is not what is accurate, but what works. So that's what you're trying to do in a referendum campaign. I'm well aware of that kind of situation. I'm going to add in a little bit here about Ireland and Brexit. Ireland is in a very unusual position with regards to Brexit. First of all, it was the only European Union state which campaigned openly in the Brexit referendum. It was fully entitled to do so in Northern Ireland. So some of the parties are organised on an all-Ireland, all-island basis. So Sinn Féin is the obvious example there, but the Green Party, it's an Irish and Northern Irish Green Party. Fianna Fáil, the party in the south, has a very close cooperation alliance with the SDLP in Northern Ireland. So that meant that you had Fianna Fáil politicians, Sinn Féin politicians, Green Party politicians intervening in the Brexit debate in Northern Ireland, but also in a slightly more discreet way in the United Kingdom, in Britain itself. In particular, Enda Kenny, the Taoiseach at the time from the Fine Gael party, visited the UK. The campaign was billed specifically as being to encourage Irish people in the UK to vote. Not to vote one way or the other, but simply to vote. This was a very important decision, and the Taoiseach wanted to reinforce that idea. Of course, subliminally, the message was, please vote to remain. This is really important from an Irish point of view. Again, others, the Irish Labour leader at the time, Brendan Howlin, he spoke at a few events. I heard him speak in Liverpool at the time. Even the Irish Commissioner, Phil Hogan, again at the time, who was the Agriculture Commissioner in the European Union, came to the UK to speak to the National Farmers Union, and again, tried to put across a point of view there. And again, that's the only commissioner that I'm aware of intervening in Britain during the Brexit debate. So there's an unusual relationship there in terms of what happened. So the first case study of the outcome of all of this that I'm going to look at is the environmental dimension, the something green element I'm going to use here, to try and look at some of the issues and some of the themes that emerge in relation to this. And again, what I'm going to try to highlight here is the extent to which the idea of wanting independent sovereignty, the ability to make your own decisions, perhaps is running into some problems about the actual political ability to achieve desired outcomes in terms of what happens. So I want to try and explore that in terms of the development of the relationship here. To begin with, if we look at environmental policy and Brexit in general, or the UK in general, first of all, the United Kingdom was very slow to accept the idea that environment rules should be set at a European level to be shared by all of the member states. And indeed, in the early years, so 1970s, 1980s, the UK had something of a reputation of being the dirty man of Europe in terms of its environmental legislation. That is less the case now, partly because the UK cleaned up its act, became engaged much more strongly in what the European Union was trying to do at the environmental level. And if anything, became a small-scale leader. I wouldn't call the UK one of the major leaders of environmental policy in the European Union. I think that accolade has to go to countries like the Danes, the Swedes, who've been particularly strong in it. But the UK certainly changed its position, and also a lot of other, if you like, much dirtier countries in terms of their environmental regulations, like Poland, came into the European Union. So the whole circumstances shifted. In the Brexit campaign, you had two contrasting standpoints on environment. There was an awful lot of rhetoric about if we are independent of all of what's going on in Brussels, we can have a green Brexit and it'll be wonderful. So trying to emphasize that. But also we can see, especially in the Conservative Party, a considerable amount of opposition to what was seen as the green tape rather than the red tape of European Union environmental regulations, holding back economic dynamism. So there's a tension in the way in which the pro-Brexit Leave campaigns were portraying the environmental dimension. So what has happened subsequently? And I'll bring it back to the Agora, the Demos, and the Cosmos, and just make a few points in relation to each of those. In terms of the market conditions, there's already been a significant dispute between in the Brexit negotiations between the UK government and the European Union. The European Union has, of course, insisted that, well, if UK goods, not gods, as I know that I've put down here, UK gods are free to enter the European Union. So Trent Alexander-Arnold, if you want to come and play for Lille, please do. But the European Union sought environmental non-regression principles being adopted by the UK. So basically saying that if there are UK goods coming into the European Union market, they have to maintain the same environmental standards as European Union producers have to meet. So there was a big row about that. The UK sort of saying, no, we want the independence to adopt our own approaches. That is still being resolved. It is not yet confirmed what would happen. There's also a major issue here about sovereignty in terms of the demos. Environmental policy is an area of devolved responsibilities in the UK. And already both Edinburgh and Cardiff, to a lesser extent Belfast because of the different set of tensions that exist there, have accused London of a power grab over environmental policy in particular. So this has become one of the major areas where Brexit has contributed to a growing tension between the regions, Scotland and Wales especially, and centralised power in London. So again, it's had a dislocating, disrupting effect from that point of view. I don't have much to say about the global dimension, the cosmos dimension, but one of the things to watch out for here is, of course, that in November this year, the COP26 talks, the latest round of the United Nations program to try to agree climate change targets for the world, will be taking place in Glasgow. Again, with some in the Conservative Party saying this is our chance to be a green leader, others more hesitant about what can actually be achieved or what they want to achieve in this context. So there are pressures here on sovereignty very, very clearly. The second area I want to look at is fisheries policy. Mike Mannon, if you're there at the moment, I hope things are not too tense in Jersey. I'm of course fully supporting our French fishermen to go out there and rescue French fish. But there is this kind of big debate about, if you like, the national identity, the sovereignty of fish starting to happen. Okay, so let's again look at some of the details in relation to this. Common fisheries policy, it dates back to 1970. It's always been a fairly controversial policy. It tries to apply common market principles to fishing whilst ensuring sustainability and conservation of the industry. Most environmental groups and sustainability groups say it doesn't do a very good job of balancing that. The market principles override the conservation. So there's big debates about that area. But it has certainly, you know, there's evidence of declining fish stocks. That probably predates the common fisheries policy. So European countries, including the United Kingdom, have been busy hoovering up too many fish for decades. It's not just a European Union issue, but there is certainly an issue about declining fish stocks. And again, that the approach has generally been to favour big industry fishing rather than small producers. The small person going out in a little boat, picking up a few fish, no. This is supposed to be an industrial-sized approach to things in terms of how the CFP works. If we take this here, and again, apologies, I'm going to throw in another Greek word here, psari, for fish. So if we look at the demos and fish, there's that wonderful comment from Jacob Rees-Mogg. The key is we've got our fish back. They're now British fish, and they're better and happier fish for it. I should point out, no fish were available to be interviewed for their reaction to this statement. Now, of course, it was meant in jest. Of course, I'm aware of that. But it's an awkward issue. We go back to the issue of what is the British state in terms of sovereignty. The British demos, when we look at fishery, about 60% of the total UK fish catch, is landed in Scotland. And about half of that, more than half of that, comes in Peterhead, the largest single UK fisheries port. So again, this isn't just a British issue. This is an issue which creates tension between Scotland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So it's a more complex issue which challenges sovereignty rather than being seen as a way of reasserting sovereignty as one of the major issues here. There's also a European dimension to this because many states European states have fishing rights in UK waters that go back not from European Union time, but go back for centuries. Obviously, Ireland in the Irish Sea, perhaps that's a slightly different situation because Ireland was part of the United Kingdom for many centuries. But also, for example, France in the Channel, and that's part of the situation surrounding the recent little piece of tantrums around the Channel Islands. Actually, not the Channel Islands, Jersey, because Guernsey actually signed a deal with France, as they were prepared to do. Jersey took a different approach, was my understanding on this, and that's why there was a standoff in relation to Jersey. So again, it's a more complex scenario. There are various commitments. Again, Belgian fishermen have had the right to fish in British waters for centuries. So again, sovereignty has always been shared, has always been loosely applied in order to produce outcomes. And we're still seeing that. If we bring that to the overall level of the agora and psari, so the economy and fish, again, it highlights the extent to which the ability to control your own affairs is not quite so clear-cut as it might seem to begin with, because there are problems of actually the power relations involved with that. Because the United Kingdom exports about 80% of its fisheries catch. So that an awful lot of, one basic figure, a quarter of UK fishing exports are shellfish that go to France and Spain. It imports 70% of the fish that is actually consumed in the United Kingdom. So the next time you're having your fish and chips with cod or haddock or whatever it might be, that has probably come maybe from Icelandic waters, maybe from the Faroes, maybe from off the coast of Spain, wherever it might be. So there's this unusual thing where Britain exports most of its fish and relies strongly on importing the fish consumed in the UK. And it is more dependent on imports than it is on exports. Again, this highlights the idea that legal sovereignty, the ability to make your own decisions, comes up against the political and economic reality of power relationships in terms of what actually works. So we have that dispute to try to resolve in relation to the fisheries industry. And then, how much time do I have left? I talk for the next 73 hours about Ireland in this context. So something in between. The Irish position here. I'm not going to try to go into every detail about this. I'm going to skirt over some of the very complex issues that are involved in this situation. But again, the very basic fact to remember is that Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union by almost 56%. Not a massive figure, but there's a strong degree of support in the north for having remained part of the European Union. The government in Dublin, the Republic of Ireland government, sought support immediately from European Union colleagues and have received very strong support from the other 26 member states. I find it quite remarkable. I've heard a number of speeches by, Slovenian foreign ministers or Estonian finance ministers, showing a great deal of knowledge and awareness about the details of the Irish situation and saying we will defend our Irish partners and allies. That is because of a huge programme by the Irish government to try to work closely with their other 26 members of the European Union in terms of what they're trying to do. So again, the Irish are getting the benefits of saying, we're part of a shared sovereignty area. You can see that shared sovereignty, the integrated sovereignty, being used to help Ireland on this particular issue. And again, of course, Ireland is the only country with a direct land border between the European Union and the UK, unless you wish to include Gibraltar as a country. And Gibraltar's position is, again, a rather anomalous one. There's already been an agreement essentially to allow kind of easier access to Spain anyway, in the wake of Brexit. So all of this has huge consequences for trade and for freedom of movement and for the peace settlement that had slowly been taking root in Northern Ireland. And it's a very incomplete process, but it's one that had been developing since the 1998 peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement, depending on which side you're on. So this is the complexity in the Irish situation. So first of all, again, the Agora side of things, the economic side of things, the UK is Ireland's major trade partner. I've got the figures there. And Ireland is a very significant partner for the UK. Obviously, the UK got multiple interests, but Ireland is a major import and export partner from the UK point of view as well. And Brexit destabilizes this in three ways: directly in terms of trade with the UK. Secondly, an awful lot of Irish exports to Europe have always traditionally gone through the UK by taking the ferry from Dublin to Holyhead, driving through the UK, and then taking the ferry from Dover to Calais or wherever. So that has been disrupted. We've actually seen quite a growth, about 4, I think at this stage, new shipping routes directly from the Republic of Ireland to France have opened up in the last year to try to find a different way. Now it's inefficient because it's a 24-hour ferry journey from Rosslare to Dunkirk, just up the road up here. So it's less efficient from the Irish exporters' point of view, but they're trying to find ways to go around the UK and avoid the implications, the complexities that have been introduced as a result of that. And of course, there's the very particular case of Northern Ireland. I'm going to put this into the global, the cosmos element of this, Ireland and the post-Brexit cosmos, because we already have perhaps 2 issues where existing international treaty obligations, which the British government have signed up, have been ignored, have been allowed, have been changed. Let's just put it that way. The obvious one is the UK Internal Market Bill of 2019, which quite specifically, and I'm actually quoting the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Brandon Lewis, saying this does break international law in a specific and limited way. Oh, so that's all right then. The next time I want to go out and rob a house, I will only do so in a specific and limited way. So I'll be breaking the law, but only in that fashion. Okay, so there's a problem there. So sovereignty is coming up against the realities of what you need to do on an international level. If you're committed to international law, you need to do certain things. Again, the Queen's speech this week announced plans to prevent future prosecutions of British soldiers. That's at a global level, but clearly has a Northern Irish dimension to it quite specifically, and that's creating a huge row in Ireland at the moment because of this happens at the same time as the formal inquiry into the Ballymurphy killings 30 years ago, which found that the killings were entirely unlawful. So again, what we're seeing here is particularly the way in which these things were being carried out, a contravention of international treaty obligations under the terms of a variety of the subsidiary texts associated with the 1998 peace agreement in Northern Ireland. It isn't just for the United Kingdom government to say what they are going to do about things like prosecutions of soldiers in relation to Northern Ireland. It is something that has to be negotiated between the different parties to that international treaty agreement. And there's actually a meeting taking place today between Micheál Martin, the current Irish Taoiseach, and Boris Johnson in Chequers. I imagine the Irish government is trying to be very restrained about this, but I imagine Micheál Martin will be tempted to make a few very pointed comments about Britain just simply tearing up its international treaty obligations. So the pursuit of sovereignty is creating a situation where Britain is abandoning and tearing up international agreements, international commitments. You can do this The difficulty is when you try to sign the next international agreement, you might well have countries saying, why should we pay any attention to you? You've already torn up your agreement with Ireland. You've already torn up this agreement. You've already said this. You've already done that. You've said you break international law. Why should we sign an agreement with you? So sovereignty has to take into account these power relations in terms of how it works. So we have a problem here where, if we think about it from the demos point of view, the peace and stability that have been developing in Northern Ireland is being threatened. There is a resurgence of sectarian violence taking place in the north. And the constitutional status of Northern Ireland is being widely questioned. Essentially, the Northern Irish Peace Agreement had tried to make the border as invisible and as irrelevant as possible. And instead, of course, Brexit is making that border much more prominent. So it's going against the principles of what they sought to achieve in the peace agreement. And this has led to demands for a Northern Ireland border poll that is allowed under the terms of the 1998 agreement. I'm not certain that'd be the wisest idea to take place, but it's an indication of how a slow, calm process is being replaced by much more tense, heightened demands being made on different sides. Again, one of the things that's taking place today is going to be the announcement of the new leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, which they've been replacing their previous leader, Arlene Foster. So it's going to be, I haven't actually heard if this has been announced yet, whether Edwin Poots or Paisley, isn't it? Paisley Jr. The two of those are going for the leadership of the party. And again, that's going to have a very major impact on how the growing debates are managed from the Northern Irish Unionist side of things. So conclusions. I would argue that Brexit has produced a situation where UK sovereignty has been seriously disrupted across all of the three frames that I've talked about. So there was this argument about we regain sovereignty, we regain the capacity to do what we want to do. However, it is producing negative effects from the economic side, the agora side. There's already plenty of evidence of a sharp decline in UK-European Union trade. There's already been a lot of firms relocating from the UK to the European Union, lots to Amsterdam, lots to Paris, lots to Dublin as well, particularly in the financial services sector. At the cosmos level, the global level, the United Kingdom is trying to find new trade partners and are trying to rebuild trade relations around the world. And that is a complex task. For the last 40 years, the United Kingdom has been part of the European Union trading framework, and it's got to try and find a different way of doing this. And finally, in terms of the demos, this demand for, if you like, pure sovereignty, the ability to do whatever you want to do, is actually, I would argue, having a very destabilizing effect for the unity of the United Kingdom. I focused here, obviously, particularly on the Northern Irish case, but we can see it as well in terms of Scotland and the demands for a second independence referendum. Of course, that is, the figures are very tight on that. The figures are extremely tight as to what might happen in Northern Ireland if there was a referendum poll. But there is a question mark over the integrated sovereignty of the United Kingdom as a result of Brexit. So it has produced these challenges and difficulties. I think that is my last page. Let me just check. Yep, I have, if anybody's interested, I have various a bibliography to go with this in terms of some further readings, some further ideas. But that is the presentation. I hope it's been of interest. I'm going to stop the screen share and go back to being able to see people at this point, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, Michael, thank you so much for a really thought-provoking talk. At this point, I'm just going to stop the recording so we can start with the Q&A, if that's okay.